The neighbor's secret. Lena had lived in her modest suburban neighborhood for 5 years. Ever since she moved there after her divorce, it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, lawns were well kept, and people waved as they drove by. The houses lined up like soldiers, uniform and neatly maintained. It was a quiet community, perfect for someone looking to rebuild her life in peace. Her next-door neighbor, Mr. Holloway, was a peculiar man. He kept mostly to himself, which wasn't all that unusual in the neighborhood, but there was something off about him. He lived alone, had no visitors, and rarely spoke to anyone. Occasionally, Lena would catch glimpses of him through her kitchen window, often in the late hours, standing outside his house, smoking a cigarette while staring blankly into the night. His tall, wiry frame, always clad in dark clothing, added to his unsettling presence. But she never thought much of it. People had their quirks, and Mr. Holloway's aloofness was just that. At least that's what she told herself. It wasn't until the strange noises started that Lena began to grow uneasy. Chapter 1. Odd noises in the night. It began with faint thuds and bangs coming from Holloway's house late at night, always after midnight. At first, she brushed it off, thinking he was moving furniture or working on some renovation. But the sounds became more frequent and stranger. One night, while she lay in bed, she heard what sounded like a distant scream, quickly muffled. Her heart raced, but she convinced herself it must have been a television or radio. After that night, her sleep was often interrupted by these odd sounds. The scraping of metal, heavy thumps as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor, and occasionally what sounded like soft sobbing. Each time she told herself it was nothing, that she was just letting her imagination run wild. But the noises weren't the only strange thing. Chapter 2. Suspicious deliveries. Lena started noticing odd deliveries to Holloway's house. Large, unmarked boxes would arrive at all hours, delivered by unfamiliar trucks, always late in the evening. One afternoon, as she watered her plants, she spotted 2 men dressed in gray coveralls unloading a box big enough to fit a person. They moved quickly and without a word, as if they were in a hurry to get out of sight. When Lena tried to strike up a conversation with the delivery men, they avoided eye contact, muttering vague responses before hurrying away. Lena felt a knot of unease twist in her stomach as she watched them leave. She wanted to confront Holloway, but her gut told her to wait to observe a little longer. The smells came next. Chapter 3. The smells of decay. On certain nights, an acrid metallic smell would waft over from Holloway's house, drifting through the air and seeping into Lena's open windows. It was an odor she couldn't quite place, like rotting meat mixed with something chemical. It lingered long after she shut her windows, making her stomach churn. More than once, she found herself on the verge of vomiting from the overwhelming stench. Then came the night when Lena heard something she couldn't ignore. She had been tossing and turning in bed when the familiar noises started up again, scraping metal and muffled thumps. She groaned, pulling the pillow over her head, hoping to drown it out. But then she heard a voice, soft and faint, but unmistakably real. It was a woman's voice, pleading, "Please, help." Lena bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding. She strained her ears, her blood running cold as she listened. "Please, someone help." The voice faded, swallowed by the night. But Lena had heard enough. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was terribly wrong next door, and she couldn't live with herself if she didn't find out what. Chapter 4. A terrifying discovery. The next morning, Lena tried to casually ask a few neighbors if they had noticed anything strange coming from Holloway's house. Most of them shrugged it off. "He's just a private guy," they said, "or probably fixing something in his basement." But one elderly woman, Mrs. Carmichael, seemed to grow pale at the mention of Holloway. "You stay away from him," Mrs. Carmichael warned, her voice trembling. "I've been living here longer than anyone, and I know what goes on in that house. People have gone missing over the years. Strange things happen in this neighborhood, and it always seems to circle back to that place." Lena's unease deepened, but she wasn't one to back down. She decided that tonight she would get to the bottom of whatever was happening in Holloway's house. That evening, under the cover of darkness, Lena quietly slipped out of her house and crept toward her neighbor's backyard. Her heart pounded in her chest as she carefully scaled the fence and crouched behind some bushes. The smell, the same putrid odor she'd noticed before, was stronger here, thick and nauseating. She waited, watching the house. Hours passed, and just as she began to think she was being foolish, the faint sounds of movement came from within. A light flickered on in the basement. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She had to know. She crept toward the basement window, peering inside through the dirty glass. Her heart nearly stopped. Inside, she could see the basement was filled with what looked like surgical equipment tables, tools, and large vats filled with some kind of liquid. And on one of the tables, bound and gagged, was a woman alive but barely conscious, her eyes wild with terror. Before Lena could react, she saw movement behind the woman. Holloway stepped into view, wearing blood-stained gloves and holding a scalpel. Chapter 5. The Escape. Lena stumbled back from the window, her mind racing. She had to do something, had to call the police. But just as she turned to run, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. She spun around, coming face to face with Holloway. His eyes were cold, empty. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. Lena screamed, struggling to break free, but Holloway's grip was iron. He dragged her toward the house, his fingers digging into her skin. "You'll be just like the others," he whispered. "No one will even know you were here." Panic surged through Lena, and with a burst of adrenaline, she wrenched free from his grasp, kicking him hard in the stomach. Holloway stumbled, giving her just enough time to dash back toward the fence. Behind her, she heard his footsteps closing in. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she scrambled over the fence, her hands trembling. She hit the ground hard on the other side, but there was no time to stop. She ran, not daring to look back. Chapter 6. The neighborhood's dark past. Lena didn't stop until she reached her house, locking every door and window behind her. Her hands shook as she dialed 911, barely able to get the words out between sobs. Within minutes, police cars swarmed the neighborhood, their lights flashing red and blue in the darkness. Holloway was arrested without incident, his face a blank mask as they led him away in handcuffs. But the horrors inside his house were far worse than anyone could have imagined. The basement was a nightmare, a twisted laboratory where Holloway had been conducting horrific experiments on his victims for years. Some were found barely alive, their bodies mutilated, while others had long since passed, their remains preserved in those vats Lena said like. The police uncovered a secret room, hidden behind a false wall, filled with old journals and photos unfolding Holloway's twisted obsession with immortality. He had been trying to prolong life, experimenting on anyone he could abduct, keeping them locked away in the basement for years. But what disturbed Lena the most was the discovery of old records dating back decades. Holloway wasn't just a man with a sick hobby, he was part of something much older, something that had been operating in the shadows of the neighborhood for generations. The journals hinted at a network of others like him, scattered across the country, each with their own dark secrets. Chapter 7. A haunting realization. In the days that followed, the neighborhood was in shock. Holloway's house was sealed off, and rumors swirled about the extent of his crimes. People whispered that the house had always been cursed, that those who lived there had been part of the same dark tradition for decades. Lena tried to move on, but the nightmares followed her. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching her, waiting. The smell of decay seemed to linger in the air, no matter how much she cleaned. Every time she walked by Holloway's house, she felt a cold chill run down her spine. And sometimes, late at night, she could still hear faint, muffled cries coming from the direction of that basement. The neighborhood's secret had been uncovered, but Lena knew it was far from over. Whatever dark force had taken root there, it wasn't finished with them yet. And as she lay awake at night, listening to the creaks and groans of her old house, she couldn't help but wonder how many more were out there, just like Holloway, waiting in the shadows.